Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing U.S. strategy towards the Middle East, the security of the Kurds in eastern Syria, and the American-Russian relations. To talk about all of this, we are joined by Dr. David Adesnik, Director of Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Jim Phillips, Senior Research Fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much both for joining me today. David, this is your first time with us.
Yes.
I want to start by asking you about the situation right now. It's just very unexpected. Right now we're witnessing a deterioration, as some experts say in Washington, of the Trump administration towards the Middle East in general, and center of all of this is Syria. What would you say to that?
Well, I think it would be worth it just to back up for a moment and look at why it's so surprising. In some respects, it isn't, in the sense that as a candidate, Trump said he wasn't eager to be more involved in Syria. In the spring of 2018, he indicated at a rally, surprisingly, again, going against his advisors, that he wanted to bring the troops home. But then there was a development over the course of the summer, and it seemed for a period of at least 3 months, senior officials were delivering a clear message that the U.S. was making a transition from the more active phase of dismantling the so-called caliphate that the Islamic State has built to a situation where we would be sort of consolidating the defeat of the caliphate as ISIS perhaps transitioned to an insurgency, as well as looking at the ways Iran was expanding its influence. And Trump himself never really came out in an unequivocal way and endorsed that policy, but there were signs or assurances from other senior officials, including an unequivocal statement from John Bolton, the national security advisor, that this was our policy to be in Syria until Iran removed the military forces under its command. So it was really after that buildup, which led people, I think, to think perhaps the earlier indications were no longer current, that Trump then suddenly reversed things and called into question really the fundamentals of our approach to the Middle East at the moment.
I mean, is there a way, Jim, that you can justify and see the sequence of events of why are we seeing this unraveling of the U.S. policy towards Syria?
It's difficult to explain given the disjuncture between the president's statements and his own advisors' statements. It is clear that the president, from the beginning, didn't want to stay in Syria for very long, and I think he was correct in identifying the top U.S. National interests there as defeating ISIS, but ISIS has not been permanently defeated, and as President Trump mentioned in his criticisms of his predecessor, President Obama, it would be a mistake to turn your back on ISIS in Iraq or in Syria or anywhere until the last nails are hammered into its coffin. And what's important is not just dismantling it territorially, but making sure that the conditions for its revival are not there. And unfortunately, in Iraq and Syria, if the U.S. pulls out precipitously, and there is not adequate attention paid to what comes next in terms of keeping on hammering ISIS, then ISIS will make a comeback. So I think we're seeing the administration walk back the president's statement, but it's very slowly and it's kind of grueling to hear.
Mm-hmm. David, you mentioned that. You said in an article on Fox that this is Obama 2.0. Why are you saying this?
Well, maybe the best place to start is with Trump's own address to the American people on Afghanistan, when he said in 2017 that he was going to pursue victory instead of the previous administration's policy of sort of accepting the status quo, continuing indefinitely. And there was a fairly extensive warning in that nationally televised address about the mistakes that Obama had made in 2011, in particular with pulling out of Iraq. That one, more broadly, is you don't pull out on a timeline. You pull out based on conditions, that when you've achieved what you want to achieve, then it's time to go. If you do it on the basis of simply the calendar, then you're sending the adversary a message. All he has to do is hopefully pull to the sides until you leave, and then he can return in force and not have to face you down. So if you go back and read that speech now, and of course it's still on the White House website, it reads almost like an indictment in advance of what's being done in Syria, because precisely the things that Trump said Obama was wrong to do, he is now doing next door.
Why now, though? This is the big question. What happened now that made this unexpected, uncoordinated decision by the American president, which never have happened ever in history, where the American president would just walk out and make a decision like that without coordinating and consulting with his advisors?
Well, I think one factor was a phone call between President Trump and President Erdogan, in which I think the president may have gotten ahead of his skis, in the sense that he may have promised Erdogan because of short-term considerations, he promised Erdogan a U.S. withdrawal that had many unintended consequences in terms of long-term implications. And I think, I'm not sure that the president realized exactly what he was getting into, but it was apparently, reportedly, a big surprise to many of his advisors. And I think John Bolton is doing yeoman's work trying to pull him back to his previous policy, which had wide support in Congress, even Democrats. But we'll see how the tug of war goes within the administration.
What do you think? I mean, even in the American-Turkish relationship, there was a lot of up and down. Why would the president of the United States listen to Erdogan and what he wants him to do?
So one of the things that makes it most surprising, it was only in October that Erdogan released Pastor Andrew Brunson from North Carolina, basically a hostage. And Erdogan has a wider policy of hostage diplomacy, taking both Europeans and Americans and basically using them as bargaining chips. He can hold them using his extraordinary emergency powers and then try to extract concessions, such as trying to get the U.S. to release his political adversary Fethullah Gulen, or other individuals such as Reza Zarrab, someone who played a key role in evading Iran sanctions and was sentenced by a federal court after his conviction. So with all that in mind, it's why trust him. And there still are additional U.S. hostages in Turkey. And yet Trump seems at times to have this positive relationship with a number of figures that it's very hard for most Americans to get a feel for why he's so positive. Obviously, another example would be Vladimir Putin, that his defenses of Putin on human rights and other aspects seem somewhat stunning, that even those who advocate in the name of realism, we must deal with some unsavory characters in foreign relations to protect the country, usually don't go that far. So unraveling this is one of the persistent riddles of the Trump administration.
Have you asked for anything in return to give Turkey something so massive, like giving away a territory that we just got ISIS defeated? I mean, we have the allies, the Kurds. Where's the answers to all of that?
Yeah, I think there are many things he could have asked for and could have used leverage on, from buying Russian defense, anti-aircraft defense missile systems, to the hostages. Some are American, some are Turkish employees of U.S. diplomatic facilities that really should not be languishing in jail. But I think the president sees himself as a deal maker, and that in some ways could be a strength, but it also can be a weakness if you go into a situation without focusing on key details. But I think Trump likes to listen to what he calls his gut, and so he has kind of a big picture feel, but is not very cognizant of the details of what he's doing, and that's one reason he should be listening to his advisors more.
Even though the president decided to make this, interesting step, in declaring withdrawal and basically allowing Turkey to be somewhat the party to take over these territories. Now we saw that Bolton couldn't even meet Erdogan in Turkey. Why do you think this was the Turkish position after this huge American, kind of giveaway towards them?
It's a little hard to unravel. I think it's important to begin by underscoring just the entrenched anti-Americanism in Turkey, leaving aside many other issues we have with Erdogan over specific issues related to conduct. Just the culture of Turkish media is one about spreading some of the most vicious smears, whether it's about the hostages in question, such as Pastor Brunson coming up with the most outrageous accusations that he's in league with spies and the CIA, when in fact he'd spent 20 years just, pastoral duties with his flock. And so you saw these same kind of attacks on the Americans that went over to Turkey and the prominent pro-Erdogan dailies. And of course, he's consolidated his control of the media. And of course, we still do have elections. Erdogan is looking forward to local elections in March, and he wants to sort of burnish his anti-Kurdish credentials, and that's a reason to do this. So he has a number of reasons to be hostile. I also think it may be partly about running out the clock. If his read of Trump is that this withdrawal is going to happen. And for example, when Bolton seemed to say there were conditions that had to be met before the withdrawal, Trump sort of fired back with a tweet saying nothing effectively has changed. So if Erdogan snubs Bolton, it could just be delaying things for weeks, for months, and perhaps he thinks in the interim, those U.S. troops will leave without him having to negotiate any concessions in return.
Is it also like Bolton is viewed as a more of a hawkish person? They don't like him in countries like Russia and Turkey for these reasons?
I think it's partly that. Also, Bolton is a very canny negotiator, very tough negotiator. He doesn't give away anything for free.
Bolton.
But unfortunately, I think the president, by making statements, especially about his desires for quick withdrawal, undermines his own leverage. I mean, he's not focusing on the future when he makes statements like this. He's focusing on the immediate present, and maybe he's saying that for domestic political reasons, like the troops coming home for Christmas. And it seems like he has some kind of understanding with Senator Rand Paul, who is an isolationist member of Congress on that score, although almost all the White House advisors
disagree, basically,
disagree with
completely with that. I mean, they did say that this is like a Rand Paul presidency now, and this is what we're witnessing. Would you go that far?
I don't think I would. I mean, obviously, it's a little difficult for us to decipher outside the White House if we don't know who is on the phone and what they're saying to the president. That the other individuals still in place in key positions, whether it's Bolton, the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they certainly haven't moved it in that direction. And one senator can certainly influence a president. Other senators have had key influence, but it's hard to steer the entire policy if the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, want to go in a different direction. And I think perhaps one important thing to add is that sort of, I guess, a countervailing influence on Trump is that I think his base still wants him to project a certain image of toughness rather than necessarily moving in an isolationist direction. And an interesting question will be, how does he respond given that some of the leading Democratic candidates actually embrace this move? That Jim correctly pointed out that key Democrats on the Hill agree with Trump's advisors this is a mistake. But if you look at where, say, Senator Elizabeth Warren is, one of the early prominent candidates for the Democratic nomination, Senator Bernie Sanders obviously made a strong run in 2016, is expected potentially to join the race this time around. They're all behind that kind of withdrawal. So the question is Trump comfortable with that? Does he think he owns it and therefore it's an advantage and they can't compete with him if they're offering the same thing? Or does he want to distinguish himself from candidates he may later attack?
What about the Kurds? What's going to happen to the Kurds? I mean, this is a very big question because the Kurds were the ones who defeated ISIS so far, not completely, but they were able to take away ISIS from these areas. And now, basically, the policy came down to please, Turkey, don't slaughter the Kurds. That's the policy. What type of leverage do we have to protect the allies who helped defeating ISIS?
Well, I think NSC advisor Bolton is trying to make Kurdish security a condition for the U.S. withdrawal. But given Erdogan's slipperiness and prickliness on this issue, that remains to be seen whether he's going to be able to do it. I think ultimately the U.S. should be trying to broker some kind of understanding between Syrian Kurds and Turkey the same way that it brokered an understanding between Iraqi Kurds and Turkey.
But that would never happen because of the PKK.
I wouldn't rule it out, but it'll be very difficult.
Especially with no leverage. I mean, that would have been a possibility if the United States stayed there and then tried to create this type of relationship. But now, how?
It'll be very difficult. I think that's the kind of thing that Mr. Bolton is looking for, but I'm not sure there's room for doing that with President Trump. With
President Trump, well, what do you think? I kind of want you guys to kind of, go back and forth on
Sure,
these issues.
No, it's absolutely a dangerous situation for the Kurds, and one of the sort of the paradoxes of the current policy is, in theory, the U.S. is trying to create a situation where Erdogan can assume the responsibilities of fighting the Islamic State. He published another column in the New York Times, fairly unusual for a foreign leader to reappear in sort of probably the most prestigious American paper. And it was sort of an Erdogan we don't really recognize for those who follow the region much. Here he is sort of sweetly promising that he will take on this horrible burden of fighting the Islamic State. He wants to be the best partner he can. He's against external interference in Syria. And, if you follow it a little more closely, it's hard not to laugh. He's already launched 2 of his own unilateral incursions into Syria to sort of beat up on his Kurdish adversaries. So it's not very credible. But here he is pursuing it, probably in part because when on the phone call, Trump allegedly said to him, okay, Syria is yours. And Trump tried to sell the withdrawal as an opportunity for Turkey to take on a burden that Trump didn't want American troops to have to take on. But then first, even if you say trusted Erdogan not just to go in and do that, rather than beating up on the Kurds, which seems to be his preference, can he do it? Does he really want to do it? How much is fighting in the Islamic State really a priority for him? And I think history...
Especially that he's going to be fighting the Kurds first. I mean, who's going to be taking advantage of this fighting between the Turks and the Kurds?
Right, so we haven't even broached the subject much yet of how Iran, Russia, Hezbollah, and the Assad regime will play. And I think one of the expected dynamics is the Kurds probably fear Erdogan and the Turks more than they fear Iran, Russia, or the regime, and it's likely they would negotiate some kind of arrangement. That we turn back the clock a number of years, the Kurds had an arrangement with the regime for a long time.
The PYD.
The Syrian Kurds were in some ways a tool that the Assad regime used against Turkey up until the mid-90s. So they have a working relationship in the past. I think the regime is amenable probably to some kind of autonomy as long as they don't challenge sort of the sovereignty of the regime. So what you could then see is sort of a shifting of coalitions and those two sides fighting over the area the U.S. pulls out of, with the U.S. having little ability to get in, even if it uses air power.
What would you say about that, Jim? About the collaboration with the Assad regime in Iran?
Yeah, I think that, unfortunately, if the U.S. pulls out too quickly, it'll push the Kurds into the arms of Assad and the Russians. A long time, Moscow has been a long time backer of Kurdish aspirations against Turkey and jointly operating with Syria. So that we could see that happen again, which would be very good news for Assad and Iran, but bad news for the Kurds, the U.S., and I think...
And the Arabs who live there.
Right, the Arabs, and I would say even Turkey in the long run. If that pushes the Kurds into Russia's arms, that could make them even more of a threat to Turkey.
It's a really interesting dynamic because in western Syria, we saw that the Turkish forces with some Syrian battalions, they were trying to go after Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, Jabhat Tahrir al-Sham now, and they couldn't defeat it. They actually, Jabhat Tahrir al-Sham won some areas in western Syria, and there were some expectations that Russia is going to be helping Turkey in these upcoming fights with Jabhat Tahrir al-Sham. But now we're talking about Russia and Iran maybe also taking advantage and being against Turkey in eastern Syria. So it's a very interesting dynamic. I mean, what are we looking at here, especially that Turkey has its own strong relationship with Russia?
Yeah, I think it's worth looking at the sort of the broker role that Putin has the potential to play, and he likes that, being the one who can sort of tip the balance, whether it's between the Turkish side or the Iranian and Syrian side. And the less the U.S. is there to influence things, the more he can do that. So in particular, if you recall the two Turkish incursions into northern Syria that we talked about previously, those would have been virtually impossible if the Russian air power had been deployed against them. So there was an implicit green light, as I see it, from Putin to Erdogan. You can do this, but don't push too far because I'm not going to let you go any further. And so what Putin may even want is a situation where the Turks skirmish with the Kurds, where Iran and Syria try to help somewhat. And as each of the parties beat each other up to some degree, he can then come into these increasingly tired combatants and say, here, I have a solution for you. Let's work this out my way. And of course, he gets some of the benefits, including a more entrenched position and just the image that comes from being the person who solves problems.
What happened to our policy towards Iran in the midst of all of this? Is it, I mean, some people are saying that this is it, basically, for our maximum, pressure campaign.
Well, I think this is one reason why Secretary of State Pompeo is going to the regions to clarify that U.S. policy remains adamantly opposed to Iran. And I think he's going to the 6 states of the GCC as well as Egypt and Jordan. There also may be some kind of Middle East security alliance architecture he may be still trying to set up. But I think the primary goal of that trip is to stress that the U.S. remains strongly opposed to Iran after these questions were raised because of these confusions about the Syrian policy.
Yeah, I think the question is how the implementation will move forward. I agree completely on the characterization of what Pompeo is doing. He has a very strong record of his own prior to becoming Secretary of State, a CIA director, previously while serving in Congress, of challenging Iranian ambitions and aggression in the region. I don't think he wants to let that go. He's one of the people who articulated the stronger anti-Iran line in the period before Trump talked about the withdrawal. And of course, it's because he understands the real threat that Iran poses should it move toward nuclear weapons and should it be able to continue destabilizing states in the region. But then the question is, how does he reassure if we are easing up on the pressure? Now, to keep the full context, it's important to say that U.S. sanctions are quite powerful. They came back into full effect last November. Iran's currency undertook a very serious downward spiral that reduced its value, although it's stabilized somewhat and pulled back from the lowest of the depths where it was. It seems that inflation has increased substantially, that Iran is headed into a pretty significant recession, and we already know it has popular protests to deal with. So there's no reason to let up. Syria has been an expensive involvement for Iran. The State Department sort of ballparked it as $16 billion is what they've spent, whether it's by providing oil, whether it's actually paying for the various foreign Shiite militia that are fighting there. So the idea that you would want to cede back the territory probably to Assad and to his patrons in Tehran that has around 90% plus of Syrian oil, that has key agricultural land, key water resources. So why make it easier? Why make it more affordable for them to do what they want to do? So it certainly cuts right against the grain of the Iran strategy, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that it necessarily destroys it.
Is that like a maximum pressure campaign, though? Would you still call it this?
I think even when U.S. troops were there, they weren't actively attacking Iranian forces. I mean, they were defending themselves when necessary, but the U.S. Generally has structured its pressure on Iran in terms of economic and diplomatic sanctions. On the ground inside Syria, it's Israel that's really doing the yeoman's work in militarily preventing Iran from entrenching closer to the Israeli border. And I think those two strands need to be closely and strongly mutually supported.
What's the leverage, though, right now in the United States leverage left, basically, in the region at this point? What do we have? What can we do?
Well, one interesting potential flashpoint is the U.S. military base at a small place called Al-Tanf in eastern Syria. It's near basically the intersection of the Iraqi, Jordanian, and Syrian border, sort of out there in the desert. It's astride the Baghdad to Damascus highway. I think strategic analysts often talk about the Iranian ambition to build a land bridge or a ground corridor that would basically go from western Iran all the way to the Mediterranean. This would be the ideal route. Basically, for reasons related to the war against the Islamic State, a relatively small contingent of U.S. Special Operations Forces has been at Tanf. Roughly 200, it's believed. I don't think the number is specified. We have partners there, Syrian Arab partners who are fighting with us against the Islamic State, and also there's a refugee camp, Rukban, that has around 50,000 people in somewhat dire conditions.
Yes.
It's very difficult. The regime and the Russians put a lot of roadblocks in the way of getting relief there, as have the Jordanians. And the U.S. doesn't obviously want that right in that vicinity. So there's definitely discussion. Can the U.S. maintain the position at Tanf even if it withdraws from other parts of Syria? It creates something of a challenge just to have sort of one outpost in a country. There's legal questions whether the mandate for the mission would still exist if it was just a single outpost. But it's something valuable. It's terrain that Iran wants. If it could open up the ground routes, instead of relying on air transfer and air cargo, which has been fairly successful for it, not to underestimate that. They've brought a lot of weapons to Hezbollah and to Assad that way. A secure and enduring ground route would be another valuable thing. It would make things a lot harder for the Israelis, who have to rely on airstrikes at the other end of the corridor. And so that's the kind of leverage the U.S. does have, and it's still deciding, is it giving away the entire area, or are there bits it's going to keep?
Okay. Do you agree with this assessment about the 10th being a good point to keep at this point and will maintain a leverage to the United States in Syria?
Yeah, I think that is a key focal point for leverage, a key fulcrum for applying leverage, and it helps protect the Jordanian border. And I think Mr. Bolton has been pushing to try to retain that, and we'll see if he's successful in convincing the president of that.
I think one of the interesting questions related to that is about the U.S. presence in Iraq. So in some ways, a riddle we haven't broached yet is, so why does Trump seem interested in keeping U.S. troops, around 5,000 roughly, in Iraq if he's pulling them out of Syria? Because in theory, the rationale for withdrawing from Syria would also apply. That initially the president was firm, we've defeated ISIS, it's over. If that's the case, the counter-ISIS mission in Iraq really isn't necessary either. Now, bit by bit, the president has backed away. He'll now say there are remnants. It's now a need to prevent them from coming back. He's sort of edging toward the understanding that I'd say his military leaders and national security advisors have, which is that even after you wrest the last bit of territory away from a group like that, they have a lot of potential to emerge as an insurgency. And in fact, if you look at the number of suicide car bombings in Iraq and in Syria, there's been a sharp uptick in the past few months. And that's a key indicator because that's one of their most devastating tactics to use against civilians. From what we understand from the outside, which is always difficult, it takes more resources to do that than an attack with just a handful of gunmen. It's not always so easy to prepare those kind of suicide car attacks, and so it's not a good sign that they're coming back. And
immediately.
It would tell us there is work left to be done, but if there's work left to be done, presumably it's also left to be done in Syria. There's no sort of analysis which would say that we need to continue in Iraq but not Syria. It's either both or neither.
When is the American going to withdraw from Syria? The United States going to withdraw from Syria? Because that also has been a discussion. You know, we'll withdraw now. No, not yet. Conditions, no conditions. Few months. What are we looking at this point? Is it easy to even try to expect what's going to happen?
Well, if the administration keeps to the conditions outlined by John Bolton, then it could be several years even before ISIS is permanently, irrevocably destroyed. And at one point, Bolton was talking about staying as long as Iranians stayed there, which may have been more of a bargaining tactic than a realistic objective. But it did put pressure on Iran to at least consider pulling out. Whereas if the U.S. unilaterally withdraws, then that just hands a victory to Iran, to Assad, to Russia.
Would you agree with that? I mean, right now, when we hear those comments from John Bolton, but at the same time we see the tweets from President Trump, like who we should believe at this point? Because President Trump did say that before and back down, say things and back down.
Right, I think it's important to point out the evolution and sort of to fill in some of those details within the very correct framework that Jim just laid out. So when Trump first announced it, he's very clear, they're coming home now. There was even some murmuring before Christmas, which obviously is an important holiday here. And then it's become a little more vague. Is it 30 days? The reports would say 60. Is it 90? Is it 4 months? And then there was Trump said at a cabinet meeting last week, no, there's no official timeline. We're going to do it the right way. It's going to be a strong, effective withdrawal, but not on a timeline. And now that's what Bolton seems to be saying. And the next step is perhaps to add these preconditions. So.
And then he's saying we have to be careful. The president.
So the answer, in some ways, is it's up in the air. Two things I would look at. There's a political timeline, right? So if it doesn't happen in 2019, then the next year is a presidential election in the United States. And that wouldn't necessarily deter Trump from doing it if he really thought it was a political advantage, but it certainly sort of raises the mistakes. If you do something wrong, if you do something that your adversary can take advantage of and inch up a little bit in the polls. So it's certainly, if you couldn't get it done in 2019, you're raising the risk to do it in 2020. And then beyond that, it's sort of a struggle in sort of a more normal process. This is precisely what you do behind closed doors before you announce the policy. You bring all the top people in, you give the various options papers, you have people debate openly, perhaps for hours, perhaps in multiple sessions. Here's the advantages of a 30-day withdrawal and the disadvantages. Here's why 60, here's why 4 months. But what we're basically having is policy being made informally in public. I mean, one way to resolve this is if Trump could give a full-length address on this subject, stating in detail what he believes, because Twitter is actually a phenomenal means to communicate with the broad public, but you certainly can't lay out a Syria policy in 280 characters.
I mean, it's really interesting. We're talking about all of this. We don't even know if the United States is going to withdraw at any point or not. This is where we are. It's a complete twilight zone in Washington. I mean, that's my understanding of what's going on. I want to go back to the American-Israeli disagreements right now on this issue and other issues in the region. How does Israel view these tactics and strategies by the United States towards Syria, towards Iran, differently than how the White House views it at this point? And specifically President Trump, I'm not talking about the advisors.
Well, I think the Trump administration has defined the U.S. vital interest in Syria as defeating ISIS. But for Israel, it has a much wider field of reference, because although ISIS is a threat, there were some ISIS positions or Al-Qaeda affiliates near the border. But for Israel, Iran is the chief enemy. And so they're much more focused on minimizing the Iranian military footprint and the perceived threat to Israel, minimizing the transfer of sophisticated Iranian arms to Hezbollah and other pro-Iranian militias in Syria, and preventing Iran from entrenching itself and opening up a new front against Israel, in addition to the Gaza Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad front, and in addition to the Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now there's Hezbollah in Syria, and Iran and other pro-Iranian militias in Syria. So I think the Israelis have to pay much more attention to those kind of forces than the U.S. does.
What would you say about this, David?
I would just add that Israel has nothing to gain by offending Trump in any way. There's no question there's been a dramatic improvement in U.S.-Israel relations as compared to the Obama administration, especially the closing months of the administration when there were some really deep disputes over UN issues. So you're not going to see anything overt, although you're seeing some comments on background. There's also an Israeli tendency to say, we could take care of ourselves. Look at, you may have struck Syria twice over chemical weapons. We've launched more than 100 or 200. And that's one way of saying, downplaying that and saying we're still strong, this isn't going to affect us. But the fact is there are still capabilities the U.S. has that Israel doesn't. And it's not necessarily a specific military capability, and systems matter, but sort of the presence on the ground. Israel can never be a presence on the ground the way the U.S. is in northeast Syria. It can't hold a place like Al-Tanf. Of course, Israel doesn't have positions in Iraq, which of course are a key intermediate ground between Iran and Syria. So there are a lot of things that matter to Israeli security that depend on what the U.S. does vis-a-vis Syria and other countries in the region. But I think it's going to keep that very much behind closed doors.
I mean, there's some headline that we didn't hear much about, but the president did say Iran can do whatever it wants in Syria. I mean, this was the headline that I have heard in Washington that was the biggest headline in Israel. Because what is that? What type of message was that to Iran, basically?
I think the president tends to use very imprecise language. I mean, especially when he's tweeting, he tends to fall back on expressions or just metaphors or similes that sometimes different audiences interpret differently. And I think he could have been a lot more precise. And I wish he had been much more precise with his initial tweet, December 19th, when, if he made it clear that, this may be the beginning of withdrawal, but it's going to be conditioned on the situation on the ground, not just some arbitrary political timeline imposed by Washington. And if he had done that from the beginning, I think it would have been a much smoother transition.
Yeah, I would say I don't think that the coverage of that comment fully did justice to its context, not necessarily in a way that would benefit the president, but it was sort of pulled out and said this was a green light. But if you read the full transcript of Trump's cabinet meeting, he's actually making a somewhat different point, which I also disagree with, but it's important not to conflate the two. And he's really trying to make an argument that Iran has been weakened substantially since he became president. So he's saying, people are saying I'm giving a gift to Iran by pulling out of Syria. They're actually pulling some of their own people out of their own accord regardless, because I've made so much progress compared to the previous administration. I've done it everywhere in the region, whether it's Yemen and other places. I don't think that's right. I think Iran, as we talked about sanctions before, has really been hurt, whether the inflation, the recession, the fall of its currency are all very serious threats to the regime. And those are deliberately because of pressure put on by the United States, but its regional position has not eroded in the same way. But Trump was really trying to make that point. He was saying more, let Iran try. In fact, I've already weakened them, which is not the message that came across in the coverage, which is more saying this is a green light for Iran to do what it wants. And it is sort of the, go ahead.
Also, when he said that Iran and Assad hate ISIS, they're fighting ISIS.
Exactly.
Russia hates ISIS, it's fighting ISIS, where they don't want us to pull out. That was completely not realistic if you look at the facts on the ground in the war in Syria. That's
a complicated issue, which I'm sure Jim has grappled with as well. And it's difficult to convey, when you have this sort of triangular conflict where no one would, I think, suggest that those parties like ISIS, right? ISIS has
but they benefited from ISIS and they exploited the ISIS.
It's not their priority to get rid of ISIS. That, in an imaginary world where that was the only threat to them, they might go against it, but they have other things to deal with. It's about reconstructing Assad's sovereignty, about reestablishing him as a legitimate player internationally. Sometimes action against ISIS may appeal to them for particular reasons, right, to move back to the Euphrates. So in 2016, basically, when the fall of Aleppo happened, after that, Assad's and Hezbollah forces were able to turn eastward and push back toward the Euphrates and reassert more territorial control. And they were willing to take that from ISIS, including some fighting against ISIS, because there was a specific, measurable reason to do it.
Yes.
And it made it a priority at that moment. At other times, letting ISIS fight with others is more in its interest. So
and helped ISIS in some fights.
So this sort of intermediate thing has been something hard for American leaders to convey to the public, that there are these grounds in between pro-ISIS and anti-ISIS that are fairly complicated.
And of course, it's the Middle East, so you have enemies cooperating in limited ways. For instance, ISIS selling oil to the Assad regime. There were even reports of Russian technicians maintaining some of the machinery in ISIS-controlled oil fields. So there's that element. And also politically, I think the Assad regime saw ISIS as a useful enemy because it helped to discredit the Syrian opposition and helped to deter Western countries from stepping up support for the Syrian opposition. And in fact, the regime released hundreds, if not thousands, of ISIS prisoners and let them get back to where they could do a lot of damage, in part to discredit the opposition. So it's very very complicated situation, and I don't think it's going to be cleared up anytime soon. That's for sure.
Do you think Israel can handle Iran on its own in Syria?
It's a tall order. You know, this is one of those things that often may turn on classified information to which none of us has access. But I mean, Israel's facing a situation where it seems to be trying to hit weapon systems and Iranian infrastructure sort of after they've already arrived. And whether it's arrived to stay in Syria or to be passed on to Hezbollah. Most publicly released estimates indicate Hezbollah has succeeded remarkably in building up its rocket arsenal since its 2006 war with Israel. So in the short term, right, there has not been another war on the northern border for Israel since 2006. They're hitting a fair number of Iranian targets. It's hard to say how long they can keep that up. And then as the situation changes, if the Assad regime recovers, if Hezbollah gets a chance to rest and refit after doing so much fighting on Assad's behalf, if Iran can get a break from its other troubles, might they then direct something much more forceful in Israel's direction? I think just strategically, you would say it's much better to have a superpower at your side if you're trying to deal with that threat. But of course, Israel is far from defenseless.
Yeah, but what about like other allies of the United States right now? How do you think they feel in the region, like Saudi Arabia, when they hear those, okay, we're pulling out, we're here, we're not there, you know, Yemen now there's this negotiations, but the Houthis are not committed to you know, kind of sticking to any of the agreements. What does it look like for these countries?
Well, I think unfortunately these recent statements on Syria have undermined the perception that the U.S. is a reliable ally. I'm not sure the degree, but I think it would be unreasonable to say it hasn't. You know, I think there's still a lot of faith and credibility put in U.S. officials, but I think foreign leaders realize that one of President Trump's strengths is also one of his biggest weaknesses, in the sense that he can be very decisive, and he does take risks to engage and negotiate with enemy or adversary regimes such as the North Koreans. And I would put the President Erdogan in the frenemy category, where he's an ally on some things, but he's an adversary on others. And you know, here's a situation where it looks like President Trump may have engaged directly with Erdogan, and in the process muddied the waters about U.S.-Syria policy. And if you know, I think the Saudis have some reason to be nervous, but what makes me nervous is if the Iranians should suddenly step forward and say, okay, let's have a summit, let's negotiate. That would be a very interesting and potentially dangerous situation.
With the administration, with the Trump administration.
Yeah.
Would you imagine this happening?
Well, a lot of things we thought were once impossible have happened. I mean, obviously, no U.S. president sat down with a North Korean leader before Trump and Kim Jong-un. There have been times where Trump has sort of tossed it off as a possibility. Perhaps if Rouhani reaches out to me, we can meet. One of the, at FDD where I work, one of the responses we've had is, well, he should only accept a meeting with Khamenei. There's no point in sort of meeting with the subordinate. I mean, of course, Obama didn't even have the meeting with Rouhani, but you know, talk to the one who's really making the decisions. It would be interesting to see if Trump could sort of overcome the differences between himself and someone who spent 70 years as sort of steeped in sort of a religious learning, albeit toward the end of something rather destructive. Whereas he has this, seems an easier rapport with some of the secular dictators, or dictators who at least, you know, wear a suit and tie rather than religious garbs like Erdogan.
Yes.
So it would be really an interesting question to see if Trump could even pursue that.
You mean Rouhani?
With either, and with Khamenei as well. So either, I mean,
Khamenei,
with
yes.
Rouhani, yes, and with Khamenei, you know, the same. Neither, I mean, they're not, I mean, so say Zarif, the foreign minister, he sort of plays the Western game more. He also writes columns for the New York Times. But that would be very different with Khamenei. And so that could be very difficult in practice.
Well, obviously, you know, I want to move in my last topic would be about the American-Russian relationship. Now we know that there's, you know, the American citizen who was abducted in Russia. We still have the Mueller investigations here. We're expecting a report to come out at some point soon. What is going on in the American-Russian relationships? There are sanctions against the Russian regime. They are, you know, good times and bad times, another fluctuating relationship.
Yeah, I think if you look just at sanctions, there is more sanctions now than at the beginning of the Trump administration on Russia. And I think relations really have become more rocky since the situation in Ukraine and the Crimea, and the Trump administration remains strongly opposed to that. You know, the president, when he met with Mr. Putin, I think was in Helsinki, did improve the atmosphere, but I don't think anything really changed there. But you know,
just
that
the press
remains to be
conference.
seen. Right.
The press conference was the big show, but nothing really happened. There was nothing given to Russia.
As far as we know, although
some have argued that there was an implicit deal on Syria at that point. There's some reporting in the Washington Post to that effect. I think strategically speaking, this is an instance, once again, where it's hard to know whether it's Trump's words or his actions or his administration's actions that matter more. Jim correctly pointed out we've seen more sanctions. We've seen weapons sold to Ukraine, which Obama would never do because he feared escalation. We've seen an increase in funding by several $1 billion for what's called the European Deterrence Initiative that General Mattis or Secretary Mattis shepherded at the Pentagon. So these are concrete things which say the U.S. is moving in a direction to deter Russia more forcefully. At the same time, the language the president has used would be unthinkable pretty much for any president of any party to defend Putin from valid criticism of his human rights record, to defer to him as opposed to the unanimous voice of the U.S. intelligence agencies. So this is a real paradox. And again, I'd say as the presidential campaign ramps up, it's going to become even more controversial, that there isn't really a necessity apart from the issue with Trump to have Russia be controversial. There's room for partisan agreement on this. And you saw that because so many Republicans were unhappy with the Helsinki issue. But it'll only become more partisan if the Mueller report comes out and if it becomes a focal point of attack from Trump's adversary in the next election.
I want to thank you so much, both. So much to talk about, so little time. Thank you so much for coming on, and we'll love to have you in the future.
Of course.
thank you.
Thank you. That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for sticking with us. Good night.